came to cooperatives as a vehicle for combining both cooperation and individual interest. Well, many things. One of them is, of course, people not having a business plan in terms of the kind of income and expenses they can expect from their business, both in the short term and in the long term. If people don't know the craft, if there is a craft involved in the business they do, say if it's baking or if it's some other trade, the individuals, or at least some of the individuals, need to know what they're doing so that they can train the others. Many fail because they can't quite understand how a cooperative operates differently from another kind of business, either because they have a very romantic notion of a cooperative. They think of cooperative as some kind of a communal thing where everybody understands and automatically works together with everybody else, and forget about the fact that people are still individuals, and that particular arrangements are necessary to help them understand one another, to have procedures for addressing problems and resolving conflicts. And unless they understand how to do that and do that effectively, they are likely to fail rather quickly by squabbling with one another and not moving forward in their plans. And then, of course, there are the usual kind of business requirements. They need to have enough money to sustain them according to their business plan. They need to have the appropriate financing and the necessary marketing skills to run the business. What's needed to develop co-ops is frameworks to do that. By framework, I mean a organizational kind of a setup that brings people together who will be running the co-op, who identify the kinds of businesses that have a chance of being successful as cooperatives, who can provide some of the training to people who are going to be running the cooperative, both in terms of cooperative practices and democratic decision-making and democratic problem-solving, and in how to run a business, and then also to provide continuing support, as we've done with the Arizmendi cooperatives, for example. Otherwise, if individuals just get together and try to form a cooperative, they have, sort of the two strikes to overcome. One is the kind of strikes that any new business has, which, the amount of failures for new businesses is very high of any kind. And secondly, there, as I indicated earlier, the need for cooperatives to also have the skills to run the business democratically and cooperatively. So unless both of those are taken care of, as I said, preferably through some kind of a support framework, it's very difficult to do more than the individual sort of boutique retail co-op that gets started and sometimes succeeds here and there. Well, we did exactly we formulated a framework to start out with that we would essentially and did essentially start, look for a site, develop a business plan, identified a business to develop. In this case, we decided on and got the cooperation of the cheese board to replicate, for the most part, their products. We got their assistance in helping to train people. We developed a program to train people in how to make decisions and how to run their business. Taught them some of the skills that are necessary to do so, both in terms of democratic procedures and in terms of the nuts and bolts of running the business, from customer service to setting up bank accounts to setting up accounts with vendors, and then making arrangements also to have them trained as bakers, so that the business would when the business opened, they were well trained and prepared to run the business, with the Arizmendi Association also then providing continuing support after they opened. So as they ran into problems, which they usually did in various ways, we would continue to provide continuing support. With once the businesses were profitable, they then began to pay fees to the association, so that this ongoing support could be continued, and there was enough money to finance the development of new cooperatives. When I say finance, I mean financing the operation of the staff that provides the support. I don't mean the financing of the buying of the equipment and other things to start the business. For that, we would help them get loans from lenders, from banks. Yes, the first one was developed through loans from friends and relatives. But once the first one was established for a couple of years, we had no problem replacing them from loan from the bank, and by and large, we've been successful in getting loans from bankers as we went along. We also hope that we're now in the process of considering how we can expand the Arizmendi model, because we do think that we have a model for development to other kinds of businesses in the future, without abandoning the bakery business, but to perhaps expand it in different ways. As I was indicating before, I think this is very difficult if there is not some kind of organizational structure, some framework. Now, there is an organization of cooperatives, for example, in the Bay Area. There's a National Association of Worker Cooperatives that exists, and a member of our staff is the executive director of that. Going to this local organization, individuals who are interested to get some assistance by contacting the National Organization of Worker Cooperatives. There are consultants available who might be able to assist them in this process, but gathering a group is really up to them right now, because there is no framework for organizations that bring together people to help them become organized and to begin the planning and consideration of becoming a co-op. Well, some of us have been thinking about that, actually, and as I was mentioning, the next stage for Arizmendi Co-op, for the expansion of the Arizmendi model. We for example, had our own fund for the financing of cooperatives and set up a program of cooperative education where, there were a series of workshops, series of educational opportunities for people to come together who were interested in exploring the possibility of cooperatives, where they would be offered, introductory workshops or courses explaining what cooperatives were about, how they function, what are some of the advantages, what are some of the difficulties, what are some of the handicaps, what are some of the things to overcome, as well as some of the aspirations that could be satisfied. And then if people are interested, then they can go on to more advanced kinds of workshops where they can actually begin to explore possible kinds of businesses they might want to enter, kind of training that they might need, get the training that they need, whether that be training in terms of some particular skills, or begin the training of how to function cooperatively and in democratic decision-making, democratic problem-solving, for example. And have, in other words, a program of educating people from beginning having an interest to gradually increasing some of the skills, forming associations with others, and then providing an Arizmendi type support system. So if you have perhaps, say, two or at least 3 or 4 people who say, oh, we really understand one another, we work together well, why don't we see whether we can get something started? Then perhaps there could be an Arizmendi staff or an Arizmendi type staff. This isn't necessarily Arizmendi as it exists now. That kind of staff could then work with them and see whether or not there is a potential for helping them actually develop a co-op. If that turned out, then these people could develop a business. They could, with the assistance of an experienced co-op developer, develop a business plan. With that business plan, they can go to the fund or go to a bank and see if they can get approval of that business plan and get financing, and then recruit other people to become part of the co-op and get going. Well, there were first 2 of us and then 3 of us who discussed it in some detail. Actually, they had some discussions for a couple of years on the development of the model. And once we had the idea of the model, we first went to the cheese board and said, well, would you support that? Cheese board, yeah, as long as we don't have to do it, they said. You go ahead and do it. We'll even give you some money for not for yourselves, but for expenses that you might have. And so we went and developed a business plan, and went to somebody who actually had a long history in cooperatives, and asked him whether he thought that was a reasonable business plan. He was enthusiastic. And we found that, and we went to friends and families and made sure that we had enough commitment of funds according to our business plan. And once we had that, then we actually began to look for a site, and we started to recruit an initial group. One was an Arizmendi baker.
And what type of
So,
people?
but this was the organizing group. And then the cheese board provided the training
And
for
then
baking as bakers.
You recruited other people beyond that?
Yeah, then once we had the business plan established and we had the financing, then we recruited other people. Then we recruited people to be staff of the co-op. We put up notices at the cheese board and put up notices at all the other cooperatives in the Bay Area, notices for meeting. And so we had one meeting at the cheese board. We had another meeting at the Modern Times bookstore in San Francisco. And, altogether, I think a couple of hundred people showed up on the basis of the announcement, hey, we're going to develop a co-op and we'll work a co-op, and this is what it's going to be, and this is how it's going to work. And then we explained it to them, and then people applied, and then we interviewed them and looked at their background, and we selected, 15 or 16, expecting that, some of them would drop out, and we started.
How many did drop out?
Well, we ended up actually 3 or 4 dropped out, either because we decided they weren't going to work out, or we also had it set up so that there was a 6-month probation period. Well, first, at least at this point, I would guess businesses that require a very high level of skills, again, unless you have a number of very high skilled people whom you can bring together.
What would you mean by a high level skill?
Well, high level skills in terms of high technology, for example, sophisticated technological skills being required, or scientific skills, or for that matter, handicraft skills, plumbers, and so on. That also needs a lot of training and experience at this point. That probably would require too long a training period for them to do it, again, unless you got a bunch of plumbers together.
Are you familiar with Isthmus Engineering?
With whom?
Isthmus Engineering?
No, I don't.
They're a medical supplies. They're a workers' cooperative, scientific. Because there are so many highly skilled technological people that have been laid off, are out of work.
Yeah, if they know what they want to do, and it's possible, and if it looks like, again, then the other issue has to do with the amount of capital that's required. So that depends then on 2 things. One is the credibility of the people who are going to be the co-op. If they have a high degree of credibility that investors would consider as reliable, then it's going to be much easier to get capital, even large amounts of capital.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the more capital is needed, the more difficult it may be to get. Except for high credibility, you can get it. Very difficult. Just recently, it's interesting that the Steelworkers Union has worked in alliance with the Mondragon cooperatives. As you probably know, and we'll see what comes out of that. But it really takes that kind of an association with a major developer of industrial kinds of cooperatives. What in this country are largely unionized kind of manufacturing, to get somewhere, and I hope this gets somewhere. With the decline of manufacturing jobs altogether, and to the degree to which, and part of that is not so much because there are fewer manufacturers necessarily, or necessarily because of the transfer of jobs to China and other countries, but also because so much of manufacturing has been automated, that the number of jobs that are available in manufacturing is limited. And so that the future, again, this is my thinking, but it's not very deep thinking at this point, and it's not on the basis of any careful analysis, I should say. But my guess is that we'll probably need to focus more on service type and retail type and replicated kinds of retail type kinds of businesses rather than manufacturing for the near-term future of cooperative development. They could be, but again, as for everything else, to start a factory, takes it has to start any business. But first, you have the question of the amount of investment required. And to start a modern factory requires very high levels of investment because you have to invest in very automated kind of thing. Otherwise, forget it. You couldn't afford the labor costs. So the amount of investment required is very, very high. Secondly, as with any business, you have to figure how long it would take before you get any net profit. And so again, you need an amount of investment that will cover the period that may be a year, 2, sometimes 3 years before net profit will become realized. In the meantime, you have to keep paying your costs of the original equipment and other costs that you incurred in organizing the business. So I think the risks and the difficulties in developing this kind of major engineering and major manufacturing kind of thing for cooperatives becomes very difficult. Unless the one thing that is possible is if there are at least reasonably successful manufacturing businesses that could be converted into co-ops. That's a different kind of kettle of fish. Well, there are large businesses that have been converted into other types of supposedly workaround, like employee stock ownership businesses, which really are not cooperatives, although some do operate as if they were cooperatives in terms of their operation. Problem with them is that they're subject to market pressures as well, and to sale on the market, which could be resisted by cooperatives, or if they're properly organized as cooperatives, would be resisted by cooperatives. And secondly, are particularly beneficial to workers who are part of the initial conversion, but are not that favorable to workers who come later. So these are possibilities, and out in the Midwest there is an organization that actually has had some success in converting some businesses. It's something that some of us have been thinking about, and it may well be in the future. That is something we can focus on when opportunities arise. How you identify such opportunities, of course, is another question. There could be somebody who's retiring, and there's also the question whether and in what ways the tax situation can be so arranged as to make it reasonably favorable, or at least not unfavorable, for a seller, or which is most likely a corporation, to sell the business to a cooperative corporation, so that the seller, can get the kind of benefits they expect to get from a sale. I became aware of it, well, in two ways, actually. There was a local sort of semi-worker consumer co-op that was struggling in the neighborhood that I shopped at, and later on became a member of, and worked there for a bit, trying to help them with their business operations and how to recruit members. So that I became somewhat knowledgeable about them and became interested in the format. Also began to do some experiments in housing cooperatives, in a very half-hearted sort of way, not very effective, but at least got the idea of how housing cooperatives might more effectively operate. And then started to really look at some of the literature in the past, and became aware that there had been in the history even of the United States an effort to develop worker cooperatives that have been fairly effectively defeated by the capitalist society. And became aware of at least some of the limited literature that was available on the Mondragon cooperatives and some of the other sort of scattered cooperative efforts that had gone on in this country. But as I indicated, my main reason for looking at the cooperative format was on conceptual grounds of seeing it as a way of combining both community and mutual independence among people and self-interest. I might also add that my family and I spent 9 months in San Francisco on leave at the time when the food co-op system, which I don't know if you know about, in San Francisco was active.
What years were those? In what years?
That was in that was in 75 or 76. And they were quite active, but were, at least what I saw, on the way to self-destruction, because they were extremely ideologically oriented. And I remember sitting through some of their meetings that would last for 3, 4, 5 hours, because one member just would not give up, would not give in. And so they didn't have procedures for making effective business meetings, business decisions in a cooperative and democratic way that nevertheless not only respected individuals but also the group. My thinking from then on was informed certainly by that experience, but also cautioned in terms of the kinds of things to focus on, the kinds of things to avoid. Well, there was a meeting as to whether or not I can't remember one incident, whether or not somebody should be given another shift, could be moved to another shift or not. That person wanted to go on another shift, and there were others who felt that no, he'd only been on that shift for a very brief time, didn't really know it well, and he should know it better before he moved on to another shift. Another shift meaning other kinds of experiences in the group. And that just went on and on and on and on. And so similar, but to me were relatively not major issues, would take sometimes hours. And at other times, they would jump to decisions without what seemed to me adequate discussion of the issue. I think most kinds of human beings can do okay. I think, human beings, well, certainly there are individual characteristics that may be genetically given, but, people who know the answers should not be in cooperatives. That is, people who are not willing to listen to other people's answers and willing to change their answers, should not be in cooperatives. People who are absolutely certain of anything really shouldn't be. Because, it's very difficult for them to come to agreement when they're in disagreement with something. And one of the contributions and one of the important benefits of cooperative, particularly if people use consensus decision making, is that you bring together a variety of different talents and information and knowledge to address particular problems. And it can easily be shown that when people do that, they make much better decisions than when they vote as a majority, or whether one or two or three people make the decisions. So I think it's important that people consider carefully, if they want to operate democratically, whether they can in fact work together in a focus on the issues and the problems that may arise, rather than on their personalities, on their rights, or their individual success in gaining superiority over others in who makes the decisions. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens, for example, if you have a majority decision, is that the danger is that you develop factions. The problem with consensus decision making is that it takes longer, and it requires much more of the participants because, as I indicated, the need for people to let go of their some of their personalities and some of their individual preferences. For example, if you come for many kinds of issues, there are at least several reasonable ways of answering them, reasonable solutions. And unless you can focus on the relatively costs and benefits from various points of view of these different, very reasonable solutions, you can't succeed if one or the other insists that one reasonable solution is the only reasonable solution. Absolutely. People need to unlearn a great deal of what they've been used to, and also what they are exposed to in outside of that experience. So that's one of the difficulties, for example, in the housing cooperatives. Some of the difficulties here sometimes. It's not something where people really depend on one another on a day-to-day basis, and so they continue in the other world on a different basis, really, from the way in which we try to operate here. And that makes it very difficult sometimes.
They bring some of that baggage back home to the interactions.
Yeah, and because they are two kinds of people. They have to act the way the others act on the outside. Now they're supposed to switch and act here, but the relationships here, meetings are not that frequent. And sure, everybody is friendly interpersonally and as individuals, but when it comes to meetings and the like, it's where, sometimes where the dominant experience, is difficult to shed for what should be happening in the group, and also, the understanding of the sharing process, of the cooperative process, is something that's difficult to maintain because it is fundamentally a different process from the competitive process. Well, this is a 22-unit apartment house. It's was built was built in the 1930s. So it needs quite a bit of repair from time to time. It has, only 2 to 3 two-bedroom units and I think 5 one-bedroom units, and the rest are studios. Most of them are quite roomy and spacious. Was organized, as I said, 30 years ago, and has been functioning quite well. Does well financially. It's very affordable, certainly for the people who live here, relative to the rents that people have to pay in the this North Central Berkeley neighborhood. Most people, there's still, I think, 3 or 4 people here who have lived here for the whole 30 years, including me, of course. And others, many other, I would say about 2/3 of the rest of them have lived here for 15 years or more. So people know one another well. Most get along quite well and can reach decisions quite well. But as in most groups, there are a few individuals who, go their own way, have their own ideas, sometimes not unreasonable. So there are conflicts from time to time, and it's sometimes difficult, particularly since we try to reach consensus on everything, to in fact reach consensus, so that some problems are sometimes not resolved for considerable periods of time. Well, first, I'm not absolutely certain that they necessarily are everywhere. I think you're right that probably by and large they are more so than others. I think part of that has to do with the fact that, at least in this country, they attract people who are more communally interested and communally oriented. They attract, it's rare that they would attract somebody who was a conservative or reactionary politically. So they see themselves as liberal, as people-oriented. Also, insofar as they really are organized as cooperatives and are aware of cooperative principles, relating to the community and including the community and concern for the community is part of cooperative principles that they should observe. And so I think many of them do. Certainly in the Arizmendi cooperatives, we strongly emphasize relations to the community as a very important aspect of the business. And the workers have responded to that very well, and most of them have excellent relations with their community and very supportive of their community. Well, actually, I've read about cooperatives probably for 50 years or so. But in terms of being actually involved in working on cooperatives, it's probably only about 35 or 36 years that I've taken an active interest in cooperatives. Well, it's made me sometimes alternating between hopeful and kind of sad. Hopeful in the sense that there are alternatives to the prevailing framework of what I see as rather self-destructive self-interest. Not that self-interest is necessarily destructive, but the extreme, the cultural extreme of self-interest that I see as being self-interest, being destructive. You know, on the one hand, there are clear alternatives to it that work. In the sense that make people that by participating in sustained cooperative enterprises, we're being part of a cooperative is part of an important part of people's lives, does change them, and it changes the way they relate to their environment and to other people in a more cooperative way. Still self-interested, but in a more cooperative way as well. So I see that there are ways that work. What makes me wonder, though, is how these can be generalized and expanded more effectively, and how we can create frameworks for doing that. For example, when I first came out here, I worked as a consultant with some worker cooperatives that were in trouble, but I also started to develop housing cooperatives, with this being the first one. You know, and I had a model, again, that I thought was feasible, namely the purchase of existing apartment houses, talking with the residents in these apartment houses to see if they might be interested, perhaps, in becoming part of a cooperative. And if a majority of them indicated an interest, then see about purchasing the property, converting it into a cooperative gradually, assuring them that nobody's going to be evicted, but gradually over time it would become a cooperative. And there would also be a commitment that it would become a cooperative, no matter how long it took. And there were some other cooperatives that had been developed in the Bay Area at the time, but they all had been developed with a lot of government support. And I was particularly interested to do that with, at least initially, minimum amount of government support for a variety of reasons. And helped to do that, in fact, with several other ones over a 10-year period, helped to develop 4 other limited equity housing co-ops. With this model, though, you know, a couple of them did have some government support, which was okay. So I knew that that model could work. I convinced some activists who had been interested in housing cooperatives and to some extent had been involved in both here and in Los Angeles area that we that in order to really make this work and go further, I didn't see any reason, it didn't make sense for me to continue to develop one little one here and another little one there and another one there, not going to go anywhere. That we need because what it needs is to purchase a building, to provide training for the residents in being a cooperative and becoming a cooperative, to deal with the bureaucracy. There's a state, there's a conversion problem, conversion kind of process that has to take through the Department of Real Estate to get the financing. And so the whole setup, takes at least a couple of years to turn from the purchase of a property to it becoming a co-op. So I couldn't see myself, developing a few here and there. Not going to make any difference. So we're convinced them that what we needed to do is to set up a mutual housing association. And lo and behold, we did. So that this and a bunch of other housing cooperatives were part of it. At that time, there was a program in its last year, or last 2 years, a government program that provided funding for setting up housing cooperatives, a federal program. And I myself was, not in favor of asking for funds to work on that, but others disagreed and they applied, and by a fluke, because we were really not ready to handle it, got a several $million grant to work with several low-income housing cooperatives that have been set up under federal programs to help them operate. We were not in the least ready to do that. So what resulted was essentially among the people who had some experience and some people who were hired a battle for the money with zero interest in the kind of model that I had been interested in doing, but only looking, really two camps developed. One camp wanted to get government money to do more co-ops, just the way they had existed. And this was at the time of a very reactionary national government. There was no way of getting that. And the other saying is, no, you mustn't go buying properties and then convert them. What you have to do is you have to organize tenants to fight for to force the owners to sell the property to them so that they can become cooperatives. Lots of ruck was sort of my answer. And so, these two sides would be battling each other and at the same time fighting over the division of the money. So, after 4 years on the board, I just got off and said, forget it, it's not going to work. And, within another 2 or 3 years, the whole organization just dissolved. And I said, forget it as far as housing co-ops are concerned, as far as I'm concerned. If there can't be a vehicle for developing and supporting them,
Yeah.
I still don't see it. Now, maybe, if I'd been more adept politically within the group, I might have been able to avert it, but it just didn't work. And so, again, I had a model that worked, but, and that is my great concern, is, you can have models that work, and that's fine. You have demonstrations, and can you transfer that demonstration to become a movement? I don't know. There is, in 1980, one of the things that happened here in California is you had housing cooperatives, but the so-called market housing cooperatives, which are cooperatives that that are cooperatives in the sense that the cooperative owns building and has a board of directors, and but where with the approval of the board of directors, members can sell their unit at market value. What got me interested is in 1980, just when we got here, they had just passed a law for limited equity cooperatives that left the equity in the co-op, but allowed only a maximum of 10% increase over the previous person's down payment into the co-op, so as to have an inflation adjustment. So what had happened also is that the market co-op development in the state had stopped because the Department of Real Estate, because of some failures of some of the market co-ops, had gotten passed a ruling that in order to have a co-op, there had to be a 100% reserve to repay owners in case of failure. Which made it impossible. Since that time, you've had no market co-ops formed. That led to the whole condominium thing. Oh, well, enough people not in a co-op not paying their dues. You know, just people taking off and. So anyhow, the limited equity co-op law that was enacted in 1980 had a workaround that, so that this did not apply to limited equity co-ops. The other thing that it also did is that for the market co-ops previously, the city had to approve each co-op. That also was not necessary is not necessary for limited equity co-ops. However, just as for market co-ops, you have to go through a procedure where the Department of Real Estate has to approve your conversion plan. And that takes a long time.
Do you think they deliberately drag their feet because they're not crazy about cooperatives?
Well, when I first started with this one, and I talked to, to make sure just what was required, I called the Department of Real Estate, and he assured me that I could not do that. No conversions possible anymore, unless I tried to explain to him the new law. He says, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about," he told me. "Would you mind if I send you some information on that?" "No, send me whatever you want to send me." I sent it to him, and then I called him again. He said, yeah, I guess you can do it if you want to do it. If you're fool enough to do it, you go ahead and do it. Okay, then we did it. Then, one of the things you do is once we bought the building for conversion to a co-op. Now, when we sold the building to the co-op, that is, a partnership bought the building.
Go ahead.
Okay, a partnership bought the building, and then 2 years later we sold it to the co-op. When we sold it to the co-op, the title company assured us that we couldn't do that because co-ops were illegal. So again, I had to go through the whole board of directors of the whole title company assembled to explain to them why we could. So it was difficult to to explain to people what is involved. And yes, I think there's considerable reluctance by some of the staff people about this whole idea of limited equity co-op. You mean people can't sell for a profit? No, they can't sell for a profit. But nevertheless, it can be done. But it cannot take much less than about a year and a half or two. And it also takes time. You know, you have to allow some time for people to come together and function as a cooperative, learn to function as a cooperative. And so as soon as we bought the building, it brought the people, you know, there were 10, 11 people in the building who were interested. They didn't say they wanted to become a cooperative, but they'd consider it. So first you have to work with them and explain the whole thing to them. Leave the option open to them. And work with them. And then gradually establish them in committees and have them begin the work of establishing, do some of the paperwork of involving them as part of a co-op, as some of the work that needs to be done. And also pulling back myself so that, they have some control.
Yeah,
So that takes time.
if they don't do it, they never learn, they stay dependent.
So that takes time.
You get to retire now?
I retired. I go to meetings and, I go to work days sometimes and
Do you have work days here?
yeah.